Good morning, everyone. I bring you greetings from Union Presbyterian Seminary with campuses in Richmond, Virginia and Charlotte, North Carolina. Should you find yourself in either of those cities, I hope that you will take opportunity to come by and know our hospitality. We would love to welcome you. And now, let us worship God. The first time I saw the movie Glory, I was so overwhelmed that at the end of it, I couldn't get out of my seat. I just sat there. I wasn't alone. There was a lady behind me. She just kept saying, "Wow." Slowly, maybe 4 times. It was dark in the theater still. They hadn't turned the lights up because the credits were playing on the screen, and this haunting music was reverberating through the speakers. And people weren't moving, they were just sitting there. Not the way they do at the end of movies today when they are expecting some bonus movie footage. There was nothing coming after the credits. There was nothing left but the scrolling of endless names that were too small and rolling by too fast to read. And that music, and the darkened figures of those people who just kept sitting and staring at the screen, and the hush of that woman's "wow" behind me. This movie, about enslaved men who had no future except the future allowed them by the men and women who owned them. Cancel them, cancel their hopes, cancel their dreams, cancel their history, cancel their birthrights, cancel their names, cancel their families, cancel their freedom, canceled many of their very lives. The 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, the United States' first all-American African-American regiment. The movie was about them. The images were striking. The training of the black soldiers who had to fight for uniforms and equal pay. The whipping of a black soldier who had to run off the camp to find decent shoes. The despair of the regiment when at first all they were allowed to do was manual labor. The disciplined fury of the men when they saw their first action. The heroism and professionalism of the soldiers as they waged this uniquely American war. The suicidal final charge against Fort Wagner on the beach near Charleston, South Carolina, where 281 of the 600 soldiers in the 54th lost their lives. The movie ends with this defeat and the deafening quiet that followed it. The way the Gospel of Mark ends with a crucifixion and the emptiness of a vacant tomb. Movies and Gospels are supposed to end with the good guys winning. But, wow, this devastating defeat, like that vicious crucifixion, where was the glory in it? The glory was in the desperation to overcome. The glory was in the resistance, the struggle to prove oneself worthy of being free and equal and being able to fight for that freedom and equality with dignity and honor. The glory of standing resolute before men and women who seek to cancel your very identity and place in this world and demand that they look you in the eye and acknowledge your worth, say your name, respect your life. Those men, those once enslaved African American men, they faced what they faced with determination and faith in God and faith in themselves. They were not just fighting for them, they were fighting for everyone like them. They were fighting for me more than a century before I would be born, and already they were fighting and dying for me. Fighting for African American voting rights. Fighting against income disparity, disparity in access to education, the matter of African American lives not mattering as much as the lives of others in moments of crisis and conflict. That is glory, and I thought still sitting in that darkened movie theater still. Wow. I suspect that word, wow, and the feeling behind it rather nicely sums up what Peter, James, and John were feeling up on that mountaintop with a transfigured Jesus, a man who had just finished telling them that he was about to lose everything so that they would be able to win. I suspect that this is why Jesus took them up there, to transfigure their vision away from the cross he had just predicted in chapter 8, the cross of death, to the glory of resurrection. So they would stop fretting over the difficulties and dangers dogging Jesus' ministry and focus on the glory of that ministry instead. There are two other times in Mark's gospel when it's just Peter, James, and John and Jesus. At 5:37, when Jesus goes to see Jairus' daughter, the little 12-year-old girl whose life had been abruptly and tragically ended, canceled, you might say. These three are the only ones in his discipleship corps that Jesus allows to go to Jairus' home to be with him when he greets her family and friends. Her corpse is lying in her bedroom. When Jesus tells the people to stop mourning, they laugh at him. So Jesus puts everyone out except the little girl's parents and Peter, James, and John. And Jesus goes into her, and what he does in the deafening silence of that lifeless room is miraculous. He resurrects her in front of her mom and dad, and Peter, James, and John. Jesus wanted them to see the glory of resurrection, the dawn of this little girl's new life in the midst of a community of people who had given up on her old life, dead to life. Wow, Jesus. Wow. There's one other time at 14:33 in Gethsemane, before his arrest, when everything is falling apart, death is looming, and in a future cross moment, death will win. Death will take Jesus. But before that happens, in this Gethsemane moment, Jesus wants Peter, James, and John with him. Why? So they can see. Jesus is the key to new life. In him, what is dead, even a 12-year-old girl, even his own very crucified existence can and will live again. But right now, while Jesus walks and talks, lives and breathes, yes, in Gethsemane, they find out that promise of resurrecting life is a threat. Whenever someone like those black men of the 54th Massachusetts fights to give new life to people whose old lives are crushed by state-sanctioned and publicly permitted death, people in power use their power to enslave, hunt, lynch, profile, segregate, incarcerate, denigrate, and maim the lives of those life-giving people. Jesus was the ultimate life-giving person. And in Gethsemane, the people in power who had profiled Jesus all across Palestine were now hunting him on the outskirts of Jerusalem with the expectation of segregating him and his seditious, troublemaking followers from the law-abiding believers, and then incarcerating them behind the bars of tradition, denigrating them with the scandal of blasphemy, and murdering him under the banner of righteousness. Jesus wanted Peter, James, and John to see all this unfolding. See how he was betrayed to this destruction by one of his own. See how he prayed to stay connected to God even in the midst of that betrayal. How could Jesus still believe in God's love and protection in the midst of all of this? How could they believe in the promise of Jesus' new life if the people in power in this old life were able to wield such devastation and death against him? How? Because of this time. Because of this mountaintop time. Here on the mountain, something very special happened. In the midst of this current trouble life, Peter, James, and John were given a glimpse of the coming glorious life. The promise of resurrection blew open right in front of their eyes. While dwelling on the dirt of the present, they were elevated into the ether of eternity. So they could see past the trees, see above the clouds, see beyond the haters, see around the fears, see through the threats, even through the titanic threat of death itself, and believe in life. From this mountaintop vantage point, they ought to be able to see what really happened in that dead girl's bedroom. From this mountaintop vantage point, they ought to be able to see what will really happen in and after Gethsemane. This moment on this mountain is a glorious promise that no matter how bad it seems, it will turn out all right. Bad as a dead 12-year-old little girl. Bad as a betrayed, soon-to-be crucified teacher, it will turn out all right. That seems a banal, inane, cliched, simplistic theology for someone who has a PhD in New Testament studies. You think I could come up with something better than that? It will turn out all right. That's what someone says when he doesn't know what else to say. And I must admit, there are times I simply just don't know what else to say. I have seen good people get these god-awful diseases, and even after fighting valiantly with great faithfulness, they still wither away and die. I have seen good men and women stand for something they believe in, fighting passionately to make a better church or a better school or a better society for themselves, their children, and their community, only to be met with derision and ridicule and scorn. And in some countries, even in our own, many of them end up losing their lives. Here in the middle of this Black History Month, I think of the many civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who lost their lives fighting for the lives of others, like Medgar Evers, killed in Jackson, Mississippi, fighting for the freedom of his people, like those 4 little black girls bombed in that Black Baptist church whose congregation was demanding equality for all God's children in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, just fighting to grow old and grow up. Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair. Say their names. Addie Mae, Cynthia, and Carol would be 72 today. Carol Denise would be 68 if they had lived. If everything had turned out all right. But you see, Jesus didn't just go up on that mountain to show something to Peter, James, and John. He went up there for Arthur, who lost his battle to cancer. He went up there for Martin Luther King Jr., who lost his life to a bullet. He went up there for Medgar Evers, who lost his life to hate. He went up there for Addie Mae and Cynthia and Carol Denise, who lost their lives because the parents of little white children did not speak out loudly enough and stand up visibly enough for little black children. He went up there for any person, any people struggling to overcome a pandemic of virus, a pandemic of racial oppression, a pandemic of societal upheaval, a pandemic of political divisiveness. Jesus went up that mountain so that Peter, James, and John would know that no matter how bleak this life gets, even unto the darkness of death, there will come a transfiguration of light. Life lived in God can and will light up A little girl lying dead in a bedroom is not the end. Gethsemane and the crucifixion that comes after Gethsemane is not the end. Almost 500,000 people dead in this country from a virus is not the end. Racial enslavement, racial segregation, and continuing racial injustice is not the end. Political divisiveness that leads to riotous insurrection is not the end. The end is the glory that Jesus unleashed up there on that mountaintop. The kind of glory we are called to unleash down here in the valleys of our lives. Up there on the mountain stands Moses, who set God's enslaved people free. Down here in the valley huddle masses of people still caught up in chains of racial and spiritual and gender and geographical oppression. Up there on the mountain moves Elijah, who faced down a prophetic horde of opposition to the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and would not be moved. Down here in the valley tremble people overwhelmed by poverty, hunger, inadequate access to health care, and unequal educational opportunity. Up there on the mountain walks Jesus, who would touch lepers, who would eat with tax collectors and sinners, who would break the laws that prevented people from being right with each other and right with God, who would condemn the unrighteousness of those who proclaim themselves to be religiously right. Down here in the valley, people kneel for change and pray for transformation. Up there, the glory of life rises like the smoke from the fires of death. We are so continuously and contemptuously igniting down here. Up there, Jesus was transfigured with the otherworldly glory of God right before their eyes. And all of a sudden, everything in this rusty, beaten down old world just dazzles. Peter is so flabbergasted, so discombobulated, so dazzled that he completely mismanages the moment. Representing James and John, he says, "Well, Rabbi, I can see now why you brought us up here." The next words out of Peter's mouth confirm that he doesn't have a clue as to why Jesus brought them up there. "Rabbi," he says, "let us build 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." Building tents takes time. Staying in tents up on a mountaintop retreat takes people out of time. Peter thinks the appropriate thing to do now is to build a little retreat center. And why not? Look at the glory all around him on that mountaintop. It's not just the light show, it's the people the light shows up. Moses, Elijah, Jesus is their own little discipleship Mount Rushmore. Live, up close and personal. Build tents for them. Caucus with them. Have a Bible study with them. Worship with them. Do everything in your power to stay with them. These people represent the greatness of their faith. Hold on to that greatness. Tabernacle with that greatness. Escape with that greatness. Don't look forward, Jesus. Forward is Gethsemane and Golgotha, a vacant tomb and an empty, broken discipleship corps. Look to the past, to the glory days we remember with Moses and Elijah. Here there is life in the midst of all the difficulties swirling down there in the valley, difficulties that will drown us if we wade back into their stiff and unpredictable currents. There is nothing but the specter of failure and desperation and death. Let us make it so you can stay up on the mountaintop and retreat, Jesus. Stay with Moses. Stay with Elijah. And let us tent up with the 3 of you. Jesus doesn't answer. God answers for him. God answers from the heavens. God tells them, "Who do you think this is?" Peter, James, and John, "This is my son." My son. He represents me, who I am, how I think, what I want for my people. Listen to him. For God's sake, Peter, James, and John, for my holy sake, stop listening to the little fearful voice inside your head. Stop listening to the counsel of people who keep telling you to keep a low profile. Don't stir up trouble. Stop listening to the voices that tell you to revel and recline in past greatness. Use the memory of your glorious past as the energy to fuel a determined fight for the glory of God in your present and your future. How do you do that? Not by hiding in tents up here on the mountain, but by listening to Him. Listening to my Son. Listen to His words, listen to His life, and the first thing you hear is, you need to get down off this mountain. Look, parents often overlook the faults of their children. God, I think, was overlooking a lot of the problems surrounding the kind of person God's Son had become. Up here on the mountain, they can keep Him out of trouble. Keep him tethered to the memories of Moses and Elijah. Stop him from trying to make horrible, troublesome memories of his own. Up here on the mountain, he shines like the sun. Down there in the valley, he filthies himself by cavorting with filthy people. Down there, he's touching lepers. Down there, he's partying with criminals and sex workers. Down there, he's breaking sacred laws. Down there, he's reviling the people who are religiously righteous. And the worst thing, this man who dazzles up here is constantly soiling his reputation and his person down there by going over into Gentile territories and preaching and acting like Gentiles. Gentiles are also a part of God's coming rule. Gentiles, for God's sake, God. How can a man who relates to the wrong race of people dazzle for God? And how can we dazzle for God if we're following Him? No, he's too inclusive of the wrong kinds of people. He's too dismissive of the orderliness imposed by the law. He's too determined to bring about a vision of the future in the present that is in direct opposition to the kind of present the people in power have produced. And if he goes back down there, we won't be able to stop him. So God, let us build him a sanctuary of tents up here where he can dazzle, and people can look up at the mountain and see the dazzle on the mountaintop and just be amazed. Everybody can stay clean that way. We could stay with him. Maybe you could even get us some of those dazzling outfits. Stay up here with the past. Stay up here with your Son. And stay out of trouble. They weren't intending tents for Jesus, Peter, James, and John. They were intending sanctified, secluded sanctuaries for themselves. I wonder sometimes if that isn't what we have done with our churches. We say they are for Jesus, but we really build them for us. Sanctuaries that too often become just that, sanctuaries. Sanctuaries that save us from too closely following Jesus. Sanctuaries where we can spend a lot of time meditating on the past, people like Moses and Elijah and Peter, James, and John, but not enough time following a risen Christ who is on the revolutionary, engaging and inclusive, rule-breaking, wrong people embracing ministry that gets his own people in trouble. What was Peter thinking? Stay up on the mountain. Stay out of trouble. What Christians are too often thinking today. Stay in church and stay out of trouble. Here on the mountain, God speaks out of a cloud. In Exodus 24:16, God spoke to Moses out of a cloud. Mark says this transfiguration story happens after 6 days when Moses was up on Mount Sinai. The glory of God covered him in the mountain for, you got it, 6 days. Jesus takes 3 companions. Yes, Moses took 3 companions. Jesus' countenance is transformed. Yep, Moses' countenance was transformed. Peter, James, and John are afraid. When the people saw the glory on Moses' face, they were afraid. This Jesus story is a recasting of that Exodus story. And what was that Exodus story about? It was about the struggle, the glorious struggle to liberate God's people from oppression. It was about the revolutionary idea that God would not allow God's people to struggle forever, that God would send someone to intervene, that in the midst of dying and death, God would foment life. Revolutionary, emancipatory, dazzling life. God sent Moses. God sent Jesus. Just as Jesus intends one day to send Peter, James, John, and us. down from the mountaintop into the valley of the shadows of death with the blinding light of life. But before you go, you need to know something. If you do this, if you pack up your tents and wander out of your sanctuaries to go representing Jesus' liberating power in this oppressive world, you will find trouble. God says so. Remember the leper touching and the sin forgiving and the tax collector and sinner interacting and the unethical law breaking and the Gentile including. That's trouble right there. That trouble will bring Jesus betrayal. That trouble will bring Jesus suffering. That trouble will bring Jesus a cross. But none of that, betrayal, suffering, cross, can diminish the glorious light of life that shall endure. The light up on that mountain is a promise. The darkness will rage, but it will not win. The end is glory, and it is all the more glorious because of the struggle. Climb the mountain. There is glory up there. Climb down from the mountain because there are desperate people in terrible need down here. But there can be glory down here too. If we listen to God's Son, if we follow God's Son out of the sanctuaries and into the valleys to transfigure like Jesus. Jesus' greatest transformation wasn't what happened up there on that divine mountain. His greatest transformation was what he did down here in our very human valleys. By speaking like Jesus, by living like Jesus, we can be caught up and transfigured by God so that we too might go into the valleys and transfigure our world. And wouldn't that be glorious? Amen.